it's going to be a big challenge. That's why projects like ours and Arafura's are getting attention, because they are meeting the sustainability requirements, they meet the economic requirements, and they're well positioned to feed into the global supply chain that you can see the stress already emerging in.
We've had quite a number of junior explorers discover ionic clays, what we think are ionic clays, in Australia, and there's upwards of half a dozen of them now. And literally 12 months ago, there was none. So that does provide investors in the space with an opportunity to get invested at a very early stage.
It's an industry, Australia's positioned in an extremely fantastic space to build this industry into becoming a global force and supplier of key critical materials to the rest of the world.
I would like to just do a quick welcome to everyone thanks for attending this webinar focusing on domestic rare earth industries, closing the gaps in supply and in supply chains. So joining us today, we have Matthew Allen, Chief Financial Officer at Hastings Technology Metals Limited.
Morning.
We have Karina Bader, Research Analyst for Materials, Resources and Energy at Acorn Capital. And we have Gavin Lockyer, Managing Director at Arafura Resources Limited. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Just a quick note to our audience, we will be taking questions as we go, so please feel free to type them into the Q&A box. It's actually a lot easier if we do it in the Q&A rather than the chat, so please put it in there, and I will be sure to get to as many of them as I can while we go through the discussion. So to start things off, the energy transition requires a greater and steadier supply of rare earths and other critical minerals to help with the build out of EVs and other renewable technologies. With China currently dominating the critical mineral space, companies around the world are noting opportunities to fill the supply gaps and to develop resources on a nationally focused level. The breakdown in supply chains, as we've seen throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, has also highlighted the need for more domestic producers and processing plants for these key materials. So I thought to start things off, we could maybe just set the scene. Where historically have the world's rare earths been mined and processed? Where are there growing opportunities for miners and investors to get involved in the industry? So maybe I will start off with Matthew, because you're top of the alphabet chain, and the rest of my panelists, please just feel free to drop in.
Sure. Yeah. Look. Thanks. Thanks, Amy. So maybe just to set the scene, I think a lot of what we're going to focus on, I suspect both Gavin and Karina will focus on as well. In the rare earth space, we're primarily going to be talking about those materials related to magnet production, permanent magnets. That is really the growth area and the demand space in this sector, and it's linked to the technologies, Amy, that you put into the introduction there. So those are the neodymium, praseodymium elements are the real drivers of value and demand in the future in this space. So where's mining happen? Well, actually, let's talk about the supply chain, because the supply chain is quite long and convoluted to generate a magnet. All the way from mining through processing and magnet manufacturing, and that's been, as you say, dominated at most stages by China. There are various players at elements. Australia is a miner of rare earth elements, as are other countries like Myanmar and the US, and to a smaller scale, other parts of the world. But really, the mining has been dominated in China, then the processing and the magnet manufacturing is heavily dominated in China. A lot of other countries have given up their technology edge in the last 20 to 30 years, and China's really seen its way into dominance through the whole value chain to generate those magnets that are the real necessary element of most modern technologies.
Yeah, I think it's a great foresight by China, to be honest. Their Made in China 2025 strategy has been to secure the the entire supply chain from an ore, as you've said, Matthew, all the way through to actually an EV or a wind turbine. So, they're the only country in the world that has that complete supply chain, and the rest of the world is now scrambling really to reinvigorate, as you've rightly said, industries that it's perhaps neglected in the last 10, 15 years.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. What the audience probably needs to remember is that the rare earth elements, there's actually about 17 of them in any given rare earth deposit, but actually only 5 of them are what you would call economic, that actually have a real value. And so every deposit has to be looked at from the view of, does that deposit actually have those particular rare earth elements which the market needs to put into those magnets? So there's a lot of nuances, and which leads into the complexity of the system, and in large part is why China's been able to dominate their deposits internally, both lower cost, lower capex deposits that have been able to be deployed by China into that supply chain.
And so we've talked a bit about, how China has kind of been dominating the industry so far. What have been some of the barriers to entry for the industry in places like Australia?
So I think that comes back again to there are actually 2 key types of deposits, and Gavin can probably give a lot more detail around that. But there's what's called granite deposits or carbonatite deposits, and then there's ionic clay deposits. And the 2 have the same source, but an ionic clay is a more depositional model, and the rare earths have already been deposited from the source into a form that makes them more readily available for converting into a powder that can be put into magnets. Whereas the carbonatites, you actually have to roast up and crack the mineral to extract the rare earth. So it's actually quite a more complex, expensive processing route compared to the ionic clays. And as I mentioned earlier, China have predominantly the ionic clay deposits, whereas the rest of the world, which have been processing rare earths, including Australia to date, are from a carbonatite source or even a bastnäsite source.
Yeah, I think the other thing is too that Australia has a history of mining, basically, which is dig it up, ship it out, and rare earth plays are not really mining expeditions. They're actually minerals processing, so they're typically being developed by small market cap companies with an exploration flavor. But really, to commercialize them, they have a large capital demand compared to the market cap of the company. And so traditionally in Australia, it hasn't attracted capital, and it's an industry which is capital hungry. And so I think that's been certainly one of the barriers to entry, over and above the complexities in actually extracting the critical rare earths away from the rest of the geology.
I think, Gavin, if I could just build on that point there, the point you're making about mining, Australia is very capable in that extraction space. I think what one of the real barriers that rare earth has is that processing chain. We really have seen through the pandemic of the last couple of years the impact on supply chains. Everything from in remote Australia, sourcing the equipment, the materials, locating them at site, sourcing the reagents and chemicals required to your site, and then ultimately exporting and shipping your product to various processing stages. What China does very well is it has that mine to magnet within a very short supply line. If you are trying to ship your material around the distances in Australia, one of the challenges we face in our project is remote dirt road access. We don't have dedicated haulage routes that are capable of taking out heavy vehicles long distances without requiring significant capital to upgrade the road infrastructure. Just a simple example. Your logistics and supply chain all the way through from mine to magnet can increase the ultimate cost of your product, which means you're going to challenge to be competitive on the world market against someone that can have a very compact, supply chain all the way through from the start of mining through the end magnet product.
I think the other angle too is historically there's been this view that, and it has actually happened, where you've got your dominant producer, and let's call it China Inc., and they can typically, historically prices have been directly linked to the cost of production in China. And when, as you've said, Matthew, when you've got basically the state sitting behind you in terms of building the infrastructure and creating the industry, that obviously keeps your costs down. And what we've found traditionally is that customers, our off-takers, who we need to ultimately finance the projects, aren't prepared to pay up the curve for product that's coming from a sustainable, reliable, friendly nation. And any new competition that's come in has really faced this barrier to entry, which has been artificially keeping pricing down. What we're now seeing is with the EV revolution and renewable energy revolution is that demand is far outstripping supply. China will need all the material it's producing for its own internal manufacturing. And so now the rest of the world is actually starting to realize that, well, we need to find alternate sources. I'm probably jumping ahead a few questions there, Amy. My apologies.
No
No, it's a really important point, because the ultimate consumer of the magnet, whether it's a wind turbine generator, an EV a producer, they're looking at the lowest unit cost for that particular product. They're not necessarily looking 6 or 7 steps back in the supply chain to see where that has been sourced, where it's been processed. And they're not focused necessarily, or they haven't been today, focused on that sustainably sourced product because it's not necessarily the lowest cost product.
So we've had a question from the audience, kind of following on from one of Gavin's points that were made. And it ties in well to what I wanted to get to next. So looking at technology funding, approvals, location, and processing, all being kind of keys to success. How are governments, local governments getting involved? Is the financing coming from the government? Is the, I suppose, the support? Do you see that coming from, the government?
Look, the current government in Australia has a critical minerals focus and has put in place a range of initiatives through their Northern Australia Infrastructure Fund, Export Finance Australia, and other modern manufacturing grants, all of which both Matthew and Hastings and Arafura have been successful in working through that process. So the Australian government is certainly very supportive. And what we're finding is that our key trading partners are also quite supportive in that space. So, it is important to show that there is sovereign support for an industry that is growing and that the world is demanding the product for. So that certainly has been a big assistance particularly from Arafura's side of things in trying to get our overall funding structure together.
Yeah, I think the Australian government recently provided a grant to a major company in WA for a particular project. It's quite an interesting decision to fund that particular project, but they have also provided Arafura with a grant. And I'm not entirely sure whether Hastings has received a grant specifically in regards to that critical minerals process, but it's nice to have, and it is important, as Gavin says, but at the end of the day, these projects still need to go out to the open markets and get investors to support the capital required to put those projects into operation. And that's traditionally been where a lot of these projects have struggled because the capital number is so large. Traditionally in Australia, it's been very hard to raise the capital to progress the projects.
I think just an extension of that is that Australia is a well-regulated nation, and what we're seeing now is because we do have such high ESG standards here in this country, that the customer is now starting to actually appreciate the fact that we are producing or will be producing product in a sustainable manner. And Karina, you can perhaps speak more on this from the financing side, but we're also finding that fund managers are looking at that ESG green aspect to projects as part of their investment criteria, which I think is a great thing, because as somebody said, if you look through the supply chain into where current supply of magnets is coming from, it might not meet those same standards.
I can absolutely attest to that, Gavin. Over the last 2 years, we've had significant client focus on ESG and the importance of it in our investment decision making. We talk constantly to companies throughout resources and energy about ESG, and there's many components of it. Carbon is usually the carbon emissions is kind of the most topical, but there's also the social, there's also the governance, there's also the other environmental aspects like water, landholder approval. And they're common. They're always issues that mining faces every day in any step they take in their development. But it has absolutely become elevated in the clients' minds. And to the point, I would argue, in due course, if you don't have an ESG response, you won't get funded. And ultimately what that leads to is a reduction in the cost of capital for an Arafura or for a Hastings.
Maybe I'll just add to your comment a minute ago, Karina. There are various, and Gavin alluded to this, there's various government-run projects here in Australia and in the US as well. Various government-funded and financed opportunities for developing companies in the critical mineral spaces to work with. Some of those are grants, some of those are commercial loans, the loan structure has been, I think, the vast bulk of the capital deployment by governments. So these are generally non-recourse loan structures. You would typically go to a project finance style bank, but the challenge for critical minerals is that the typical PF structure, project finance structure, has a belt and braces approach. It usually involves a fixed offtake, a reduction in risk around the commodity price, an EPC fixed price lump sum contract, and a whole range of other belt and braces approach. And those 3 or 4 I just mentioned are very, very hard for a critical minerals project to provide the surety that a project finance bank would typically look for. A gold project, it's a very cookie cutter type approach. Critical minerals, it's an emerging space, and that's where governments have had to step in and provide these cornerstone loan type structures, because it'll bring the balance of the finance with it that gets these projects off the ground, and it gives the off-takers comfort that that project will be able to deliver a product to market in a given time frame. There's plenty of aspiring projects around the world, in Australia and globally, and it's really trying to identify who can put all those elements together with the resource to deliver a product to a market and a customer in a given time frame. That's ultimately what your off-taker wants to see, and that's why governments have had to step in and break that nexus to get these projects off the ground.
So we've had a few questions coming in relating to kind of the government support, but looking at the environmental approval process. How does it work? How do you kind of work with the higher emissions or the higher kind of environmental impact from these types of projects?
I wouldn't say these projects are necessarily higher emissions. You're going from a zero base, obviously being an exploration company, to an emission. There are key challenges in the environmental space that have to be managed. The way we're looking at it is, looking to involve as much renewable energy sources in the supply chain that we can. So we're working with electricity providers who have got various degrees of renewable energy being built into their supply chain. We're looking at off-grid power sources that can involve solar as well to reduce energy intensity. But the environmental footprint of a project is obviously going from 0 to a number as part of the development of the project. And as Karina mentioned, there's a full ESG horizon to consider here. The interaction with traditional owner communities, the interaction with social communities, your supply chain, as well as the the specific carbon footprint that comes with putting a new project into operation.
Yeah, look, I think too the environmental standards in Australia are extremely solid, and and most of people sort of tuning into this this Zoom would know that most rare earth projects do come with a degree of naturally occurring radiation, and that has its own environmental challenges. But to be honest, it's no different to a granite quarry in terms of its background radiation, and most of us have granite bench tops in our kitchens, and we don't seem to be worried too much about it. Having said that, we do need to deal with the waste, and Australia's got appropriate protocols in place to do that, and both our projects here have gone through that process. It is onerous to a certain extent, but I don't see it's onerous to a point where it actually stops projects getting up and running. I think it's something that's necessary to ensure that we're operating in a responsible manner. In terms of the the emissions side of things, I agree with Matthew. We're going from nothing to something, and we also have a target of zero emissions by 2050, and aligned with most of the world. We're lucky with our particular project. We're right bang in the middle of Australia. We do have a lot of natural solar radiation. The Northern Territory is going to be host to one of the largest solar plants in the world to supply Singapore. So there's sort of evidence there that solar works in our region, and we certainly have earmarked a solar farm for the project to ultimately, over time, reduce our reliance on fossil fuels and therefore reduce our emissions.
So again, that goes back to one of the barriers to entry for these types of projects. Is not only are you you're dealing with the chemical complexity and the processing complexity, you're dealing with the approvals process complexity, you are also then dealing with the cost of energy to get your product into market. And Australia, as the two potential producers have mentioned, energy is a key component, but we are in Australia very lucky. We can do that relatively inexpensively, but it does mean it's an upfront capital, a low operating cost. So it adds to that CapEx number up the front end. And the questions ultimately are, to sort of Matt's point, in how you can financially engineer that, whether you do it in a boot type structure where someone else owns the infrastructure, builds it, and then charges you a tariff to reduce that capital call up front. Or if not, then you have to look at including that in your capital, and those numbers just keep growing. They don't ever come down.
I mean, we had a few questions saying that, looking at the high cost of production, is this the case, that it's significantly higher than other commodities? Another question was asking, can it compare with those types of resources being developed in China?
Well, I'll say yes is the short answer. I mean, our feasibility study shows that we're actually in the lowest quartile of potential producers per kilogram of NdPr, and that's even compared to the largest Chinese groups. Our cost of production, we actually produce a phosphate as a product as well, so we're lucky we get the revenue credit there. But without the revenue credit, our costs of production are probably around $33 per kilogram of NdPr. Now, we understand from our research that the cheapest that China Northern produces is around $40 a kilogram, and they're the largest producer in the world. So I would say, yes, we can be competitive, and that's fully costing in also all the environmental impacts and rehabilitation costs, et cetera, which we must abide by here in Australia. And that's the answer from Arafura's perspective. I'm sure Matthew's got similar
Oh, look, I mean, we've published our numbers earlier this year as well, and we're obviously in the middle of a mining boom here in Australia, WA in particular, and our recent cost estimates put us at about $45 US per kilogram of NdPr against Gavin's description. Now, the challenge with rare earths is in two dimensions. You've got to look at the capex opex dimension, the cost base, the all-in cost base. And I saw there was a question asking about, how can EPC providers look to build and run these projects cheaper? Well, Karina made the comment earlier, and I'll reiterate it, that rare earth projects are not ubiquitous. Each of them has a different flow sheet. Gavin just described phosphates that come out of apatite. Carbonatites and hard rock mining have a different cost base, a different processing chain. And to deliver our intermediate product, we'll be continuously mining our deposits with a relatively high strip ratio. But you then need to look on the revenue side, how much revenue you can generate per kilogram of final product, and that's a function of the endowment you have of the specific elements that are the ones that are in demand. And as Karina said, there's only a handful that you're able to actually generate an economic return on. And unless you have a sufficiently high endowment of those key elements that relate to magnet manufacturing, your project won't get off the ground. You will not break even or be competitive against the rest of the world unless you've got those two combinations. So it's very hard to line two rare earth projects up alongside each other and say one is better than the other on a cost metric or a revenue metric. And it's also quite opaque with inside China, as Gavin said, to the best of people's knowledge. You're not dealing with public companies inside China, you're dealing with government enterprises that don't publish these numbers. So all you can reference really is the ultimate benchmark price and how that fluctuates on the open market to get a gauge of where the supply demand and the market balance is sitting versus the ultimate price people are willing to pay for the final product.
So we've had a few questions coming in looking at the importance of downstream production facilities. So somebody asked, the downstream processing and refining are very capital intensive, which poses challenges for junior developers. Do you see any opportunity for consolidation in the downstream processing that may improve the commercial viability of projects?
That's a good question. There are, for example, there's Neo Performance Metals, I think is their full name, are a TSX listed company, and they currently produce the final magnet product, and they have a series of plants around the globe in order to do that. Would they be interested in, and so they contain, and that is also one of the barriers to entry for this space, is the IP around that step. So not only do you have to develop your IP to process your bespoke deposit, which, as Matt mentioned, no two deposits are the same, you then have to develop your IP around how to process it into a magnet. And again, that's not necessarily the same. However, and the reality is Lynas has managed to achieve that in their Malaysia plant, and they're talking about expanding production, and they're doubling their Malaysian production of that finished powder, neodymium powder, which won't really be available until 2025. So can you create consolidation? I think there are some parts of that supply chain where you can have consolidation, but as Matt mentioned, there's an awful lot of bespoke features which I think make that harder. It's not widgets, it's not iron ore, it's not coal, it's not oil, it's quite bespoke, every single deposit, and also each chemical composition within those deposits that you would process.
Yeah, I think that's dead right, Karina. I mean, we couldn't, for instance, dig our material up, ship it to Malaysia and have it processed. It just wouldn't, we'd get recovery, but we wouldn't get as good recovery as we get with our individual flow sheet, and Matt's deposit would be the same. So yeah, they are a bit bespoke at the front end. When you ask about downstream, it depends on what point you're breaking that downstream. So once you've got actually a rare earth carbonate or a rare earth sulfate or a rare earth, just a mixed rare earth product away from everything else, then yes, that's potentially where consolidation in the industry in terms of rare earth separation could perhaps occur. And then, as you've said, making converting those oxides to alloys and magnets and what have you. Certainly that's a process that could be consolidated, but there's a whole raft of, apart from IP, there's a whole raft of other barriers to entry there, and namely it's electricity. Doing that in Australia would be extremely expensive, and it's only through subsidies in the US that that industry is really starting to take off over there.
I think also as a startup, one of the challenges is knowing your limitations. As a startup company, starting up a mining operation and at least preliminary intermediate stage processing has enough technical challenge, enough capital risk, and enough execution risk. Most startup companies, and the Lynas examples are one that everyone in the industry looks at. That wasn't a seamless switch on commissioning operation. That took a number of years for that operation to get to capacity. And to become competitive.
And to meet specification, Matt, as well.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
So it's not the sort of thing, as a startup looking for finance, that you can sit there and convince people on the other side of the table that you can go, all the way into the latter stages of processing from first commissioning. You have to know your limitations, work to your strengths, and integrate into the global market in the most appropriate way, so that you're there for the long run. You're not here for a couple of years and then blow up.
You're dead right. And one of the reasons we spent so many millions of dollars in piloting is exactly as you've said. We all watch Lynas and we want to learn from their mistakes, and they've done a fantastic job to do what they've done. Hats off to them. But it's cost us a lot of money and a lot of time. And we can't go to people like Carina and other players in the industry asking for money for development when they say, well, what have you done to de-risk it? Learning from the Lynas experience, what have you done to de-risk it? That just comes with more money and more piloting and more test work.
So I was thinking we could kind of change topics a little bit. I wanted to look a little bit broader at kind of the supply demand outlooks for the rare earths, their growing role. But then also we had a question from the audience that ties in quite well, asking, how do you think the USA designation of critical industries or critical minerals and supply chains will impact availability moving forward?
I think that people need to be mindful. It's great. Government support, as Gavin and Matt have both mentioned, it's an incredibly important piece of the puzzle, and it does provide confidence broadly within industry and with your offtake partners and customers. It really helps. But at the end of the day, if you put $1 down today, you're not necessarily going to get revenue for another 10 years potentially on some of these products. So it's not a straightforward process. And the investors need to be aware that these can take quite a long time. We've mentioned Lynas, it really did take them, let alone the construction phase, which took over 2 years. It then took another 5 years to get to anywhere near nameplate on that plant and commission it and resolve all of those commissioning issues before they were in a position where they were actually becoming profitable. And the only reason they survived was that their lender basically gave them an interest-free holiday. If they'd called their loan, Lynas would have gone. And commodities, as we know, is cyclical. The price of those commodities is cyclical. And that is one thing that government really can't influence. The market influences those commodity prices. So you can get a project financed and started to construct at the best of the cycles. By the time they're producing their powder, it could be the bottom of the cycle. and you're trying to do payback on that capital that you've initially invested to stay alive. And it's a volatile area, and it can take time.
I think to answer the first part of your question, Amy, which is, where's the market going more broadly? And it's something I'm sure, Gavin in their planning and projections has a similar view on. I think we've all started to realise the importance of the materials, the critical minerals, and that's why governments are designating, a critical mineral supply chain in Australia and in the US, that these are materials that are going to be significantly in demand growth and supply shortfall over the next 2 decades at least. All the projections we see indicate that the demand for the magnet-related rare earth elements is going to grow at something around 8% per annum compounded growth. Now, that's a market that will grow from circa 50,000 tonnes of product a year to well over 150,000 tonnes of product over the next 15 or so years, a tripling of the market. Now, a project of our size will deliver about 3,500 tonnes of those magnet rare earth elements into the global market when it comes online. And you're going to need to build a new project of our size every year for the next 15 years just to meet the demand growth. So it's a huge challenge for the industry to get these projects off the ground, commissioned, and to deliver the supply that's going to be needed to meet the growth in demand from wind turbines, electric cars, and other technologies that use these permanent magnets. So, it's going to be a big challenge. That's why projects like ours and Arafura's are getting attention, because they are meeting the sustainability requirements, they meet the economic requirements, and they're well positioned to feed into the global supply chain that you can see the stress already emerging in. And you just look at the benchmark pricing, what's happened in the last 18 months to the NdPr oxide price on Asian metals. Back in 2020, we were trading at $50 a kilo. Back in February, we were trading at $170 a kilogram. It's currently in the sort of 130s, but nobody sees a price reversion back to $50 a kilo in any price projection I've seen from any of the forecasting houses. I think the incentive level for new supply to hit the market is somewhere in the $90 to $100 a kilogram, and that's why you're starting to see a rapid acceleration of projects into the development cycle.
Yeah, look, I agree with everything Matthew just said in terms of the pricing. And what we're seeing too is, demand is growing exponentially, as he said, but supply is limited. These projects take time, and there's only a few projects globally that, when the GFC hit, continued their development pathways, and Hastings was one, Arafura was another. And as Karina rightly said, if it wasn't for the lenders in Lynas, they would have been in some strife too. And I might add that lender was actually the Japanese government ultimately. So governments do have a role to play here, because the financial markets per se have been broken in this space. So until there's an industry up and running with more than one or two suppliers, we're constantly going to face this challenge. And the Australian government's seen that. They've stepped in with their critical mineral strategy. They've you touched on, Amy, there with the US. Look, I was with an Australian government delegation just after President Trump was appointed, and we were in Washington, and everybody was shaking hands and patting each other on the back for critical mineral supply. And the US introduced the John McCain bill, which basically prohibited the Department of Defense from purchasing NdPr or neodymium rare earth magnets from any country that was deemed hostile, and they named them, and I'm sure we all know who they are. And I thought, great, this is going to be magic. US is going to be throwing money at the industry, et cetera, et cetera. And here we are, several years later, and a change of administration, and not much has changed. Because when you read that legislation, it says they can't purchase those magnets from certain countries unless you can't get it anywhere else. And as Matt alluded to at the start, industry has historically been going, I can buy as much as I want, as cheap as I can, from a particular supplier. Therefore, why should I underwrite your project by paying you a premium to the $50 price that was prevalent for a very long time? But now that we're seeing pricing actually match more of a real demand supply analysis, I'm sure Matthew's the same as us. We've got people absolutely coming to talk to us now about offtake, and price is not necessarily a big issue anymore. Whereas before we were asking for floor prices to support our debt financing. Those prices are now starting to say, well, can you give us a fixed price? And it's a nice place to be in, having been through the lows.
Interesting. I guess I mean that kind of wraps up all of the questions that I had. If we don't have any others from the audience, I suppose, you know, maybe we can just wrap things up, asking, you know, this webinar was really focusing on Australia and what's happening there. And maybe if we would just want to take a quick look at kind of outlook or interesting developments that you see on the ground.
Yeah, I'll take that first if you like, Amy. The interesting thing over the last 12 months, you've actually seen quite a number of ASX juniors discover what we think are, we're not 100% sure yet, but we think are ionic clay deposits in Australia. Now, traditionally, it was felt that there was a real geological bias, and China geologically had a proliferation of that type of deposit, which is what's given them the advantage over the last 20, 30 years. But now it really is starting to look like it's only because nobody's ever actually looked in Australia. And so you've had quite a number of junior explorers discover ionic clays, what we think are ionic clays in Australia, and there's upwards of half a dozen of them now. You know, and literally 12 months ago, there was none. So that does provide investors in the space with an opportunity to get invested at a very early stage. As I said, fair warning, it takes time and there's no guarantees. And these projects are yet to go through all of the hurdles required to get anywhere near where Hastings and Arafura are today. The reality is Hastings and Arafura are literally right at the point where they're able to cross that divide from a developer into production, subject to their FID, which really just means subject to financing. But there are these large number of juniors really out there now, upwards of half a dozen, who could potentially be invested in by potential investors. So I think that's quite interesting. It's quite exciting because it's new. We didn't know of these things before, so there's a lot to play out in that space. And if we can manage to develop an ionic clay industry in Australia, that does change that capital requirement metric, and it can potentially, and interestingly, they've been discovered in locations which are not as remote from what were once traditionally manufacturing hubs, particularly South Australia. And so I think that, you know, and a bit north of Albany port, there are possibilities that they could be advanced perhaps a lot quicker than traditionally can be in the rare earth space.
Yeah, I don't think anyone, well, I suppose one of the misnomers of the industry is the title, rare earths. You know, rare earths are not rare per se. You know, this is a space that Gavin put it before. It takes a number of years not to just, you know, drill and identify through assaying the resource, but actually perfecting the flow sheet, because the host minerals are your problem. You've got to be able to separate your host from your host minerals, the ones you want to extract for further processing into the intermediate products, and that's what takes the time. You know, anyone can go out, kick a few rocks, and say, right, I found Rio. You know, in fact, the history of Yangibana was originally around uranium exploration back in the 80s, and it wasn't until 10 or 15 years ago that people actually started paying attention to the rare earths in that area that are commonly associated with naturally occurring radioactive material, and started to work out the flotation cycle. How can you upgrade through the beneficiation from a 1% head grade to something that actually is a concentrate is economic. and that's where it takes time. So, an explorer today is still, 8 to 10 years away from something that, based on current life cycle generation, would get you progressed to the types of conversations and developments you can talk about. The concept of going beyond these intermediate products into any of the other stages at the moment of downstream processing in Australia, I think as a country we're still quite away from that. There's been a number of examples of very, very large companies that have had a crack at the downstream technologies or processing in various other industries, and that Australia has typically not been very successful investing further downstream of the primary processing and the chemical industry. We're seeing lithium now take off. Australia's lithium industry in the last 4 or 5 years has just boomed. There's a number of plants being built here in WA, and that industry, if you look at the life cycle that I think the rare earth industry will follow, it will probably be a very similar pathway. There'll be an initial few people that break ground, and then you'll start to see the industry develop. It'll get a more established pathway from exploration through development and into production. But it's going to take a generation of the next projects to get up, prove we can do it, and then you'll see the industry grow from there.
Yep, 100% agree, Matt. And look, I think the current government, through its modern manufacturing initiatives, is really encouraging that downstream processing rather than the dig it up, ship it out model. And we're certainly in that space. There was a question that came through about metallization. Most of our customers actually want rare earth metal, so we actually have a tolling arrangement in place with a metallizer, but that's not in Australia. We would love to do that in Australia, but unfortunately it's quite cost prohibitive in terms of it requires a lot of electricity, but maybe renewable energy might help develop that industry here in Australia. And I think just more broadly as an industry, Australia's positioned in an extremely fantastic space to build this industry into becoming a global force and supplier of key critical materials to the rest of the world. And it's quite exciting times. And as I think it was Matthew alluded to, there's more than enough room for Hastings and Arafura and a few others to get up and running and deliver product into the market. I will just comment though, when Karina was talking about the ionic clays, yes, it's exciting that that's a new sort of wave of potential projects coming through. But historically, the ionic clays are also enriched in the heavy rare earths, whereas Matt's project and our project are more enriched in the lighter rare earths and the NdPr or neodymium praseodymium, which is key to the magnets as well.
Yeah, that's the market that's going to grow by the tens of thousands of tons per annum. The demand around the heavies, particularly dysprosium and terbium, they're much smaller markets. They're a few thousand tons per annum. So you don't need a lot of those to add to the magnets, and they're generally an additive rather than the core ingredient of the permanent magnets. They're used for particular heat treatment and specifications of magnets for high performance purposes.
But don't get me wrong, if we had more heavies in our deposit, I'd be happy as well.
Sounds great.
I think the description by Geoscience Australia is just to quote something from Monday night's Four Corners project. We're the salt and pepper, I think, Gavin, of the industry.
That's right. It was a good show.
Well, I think that that brings us to a really good place to sort of wrap it up. Really great insights from our panelists today. So I want to thank Matthew, Karina, and Gavin for all taking part today, and for our audience who asked a lot of really great questions. So thank you, everyone. In terms of, for APAC, we will be coming back with live events in October. So starting out with Singapore and then Sydney in the first 2 weeks of October. So we look forward to seeing everyone at an in-person event really soon. So thank you.
Thanks, Amy.
Thanks, Amy.
Thank you.